Hello and welcome everyone. Good afternoon and thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. It promises to be an extremely fascinating conversation. My name is Tara Alice. I'm the Chair of Trustees at Pro Bono Economics, where our mission is to understand and tackle the causes of low well-being and the consequences of them as well. And I can't think of anything more important than doing that for our young people and for our children, because they really are the future. And so I'm really excited to be introducing this session today. We are excited to be bringing you a lot of insight and interesting content from a collaboration we've done with Power2 Rediscover, which looks at young people's well-being and what we have ended up calling in the report the tangled web of low well-being, poor belonging, and school attendance, which feed together into something that's problematic for quite a lot of young people. And we're also excited that we're going to be hearing about interventions and learning from programs that actually work to resolve those issues and help those young people get onto a better path. In our discussion today, we will be rooting our discussion in the findings of a recent PBE report for Power2 Rediscover, which was called Building Belonging, the Impact and Value of One-to-One Support on Young People's Wellbeing and School Attendance. And you'll hear more about it, but in addition to looking at what that program does, it very specifically looks at the value for money of the activities. So getting to the bottom of what's the actual impact of these support programs. Before we get started, I should share that today's event is being recorded and it'll be available on the PBE website as well as our YouTube channel after the session. And towards the end of the session, we will have some time for audience questions. So feel free to add your questions to the chat and we'll cover as many of them as we can in that Q&A. The report is now available on our website as well, and a link should be appearing in the chat very soon. And we'd love you to share your thoughts about the webinar, the report, and the insights you're going to be hearing on social media. So tag us on LinkedIn or Blue Sky and use the hashtag PBE events anywhere else. And with that introduction, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by a brilliant panel of speakers today. We have a lineup that couldn't be better for this topic, with expertise and insight from a broad range of different disciplines and really the frontline delivery as well. First of all, we have Julian Daniel, who is the Power2's program lead in the Northwest. And also from Power2, we have Julie Randalls, who's the chief executive. We're joined by Maliha Rahanaz, who's an economist at PBE. And finally, last but not least, we have Neil Humphrey, Professor of Psychology of Education at the University of Manchester. So thank you all so much for joining today for this discussion. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get into it. And I'd like to start with you, Julie. Could you start by telling us a little bit about how young people are experiencing low well-being at this point in time and how that can lead to poor school engagement?
Thanks, Tara. So over 100,000 children and young people have almost entirely disappeared from education. And that's the equivalent of a child in every single seat in Wembley Stadium and still having a queue of 10,000 more waiting outside the grounds. And what isn't talked about enough is what life is like for these children and young people when they aren't in school. The obvious point is that their educational attainment declines, but they are also more likely to be at risk of criminal exploitation. These children are more likely to have disabilities, mental health needs, or special educational needs. They are often stripped of the opportunity to have a childhood. Poor belonging also has a huge part to play in this. Children and young people spend most of their waking hours at school, of course, and it's such an important touch point for interventions. There are so many factors that contribute to a sense of belonging, that the young person has friendly, supportive, and fair relationships with teachers, being part of a friendship group, a positive and inclusive school environment where pupils feel physically and emotionally safe, for example. And a strong sense of belonging at school significantly improves pupil outcomes, including academic performance and attendance. Pupils who feel a sense of belonging are more likely to be engaged and motivated, both of which are key indicators of successful learning. And the benefits of school belonging carry on into adulthood, influencing future career decisions and overall life satisfaction. And on the other hand, if children and young people don't feel accepted, respected, included, or supported in school, they are more likely to be absent and far less likely to succeed in education and to be happy and successful as an adult. And children and young people with poor well-being or special educational needs are more likely to have a poor sense of belonging. It's a vicious circle. But it doesn't have to be. At Power2, we help schools and local authorities across England respond to an escalating mental well-being crisis. We support children and young people with their well-being and engagement with school and society when they need it and before things get worse. We hear from teachers that the day our programmes are on in school is the one day of the week that pupil would be in. Teachers are then able to have touch points with the pupils they are otherwise struggling to see regularly. We work with over 1,200 children and young people a year, all of whom are living in poverty and have social, emotional and mental health challenges, which may manifest as low self-confidence and self-esteem, poor communication skills, disengagement in the classroom or distressed behaviour. Around a fifth are in the care system and around a sixth have special educational needs. And of course, all these things are interlinked and often lead to school absences or exclusions, rates of both of which are also increasing alongside rates of poor well-being. And it's not okay that children and young people aren't in school, but the solution isn't about tougher punishments for parents and pupils. The solution is intensive support for children when they are beginning to disengage. And it's vitally important that we provide this support now before we deprive a whole generation of the opportunity to have a childhood.
Thank you, Julie. It sounds like such a serious problem, but also a very complex one, not an easy one to tackle. But what I love about your approach is that empathy of let's not make these people feel even worse about the problems they have, but let's meet them where they're starting from and try and help them best we can. And I'm sure you will say a lot more about the exact ways in which you do that. But being such a complex problem, it's difficult to measure, I'm sure. And so I'd love to go to Neil next to tell us a bit about what is the Be Well project and how is it linked and how does it help us actually understand this relationship between low well-being and low school engagement.
Thanks, Tara. So hi everyone, so I'm Neil Humphrey from the University of Manchester and I'm the academic lead for the Be Well programme. So in a nutshell, Be Well is about making young people's well-being everybody's business. The starting point for that and the kind of central backbone, I suppose, of the programme is we do an annual survey each year of different aspects of young people's well-being and the things that young people tell us influence their well-being in secondary schools. We do that every year in the autumn, and then we use the data in different ways, some of which are directly relevant to what we're talking about tonight, to try and influence practice on the ground. And to give a sense of scale, and I really liked Julie's analogy of using the football stadium, so I'm going to do the same. We've surveyed 135,000 young people since Be Well began. That would fill Old Trafford and the Etihad Stadium in Manchester. So it's a lot of young people. So we've got a really rich data set, and it's all driven by what young people have told us is important to them. So we do a lot of consultation with young people about the topics that we survey them on and what we do with the data. So we gather all of that data. Some young people we're tracking over time, so we can start looking at change. And others, it's a kind of a snapshot each year. So we gather those data, we push it back to schools via their own private dashboards. We have a public neighbourhood dashboard. We write reports, we do analyses, all those kinds of things. The idea is to create what hasn't been there prior, which has been a good evidence base and a good data source for schools to act on in terms of improving practice, and our other partners, anyone that's involved with young people. So specifically to the point around school engagement and school belonging, I think we can do two things. One is around using the data to start to establish how important is school belonging for young people's well-being, and I'll speak for a couple of seconds about that. But then also we can do the kinds of evaluation work that we've done with the Power2 Rediscover program, where if you take an intervention like Power2 Rediscover that has at its heart, among other things, that idea of kind of re-engaging young people who are vulnerable, and then looking at, well, does that impact well-being? So on the first point, we've got a couple of studies now that have looked at the relationship between school belonging and well-being. The first one, and these are all on the BeWell website and publicly accessible, the first one looked at a range of school-related factors, including bullying, including a whole range of other things, peer relationships to teachers and so on, that our measure of school belonging was the strongest predictor of later well-being among young people. So of all the different drivers that we looked at in that particular study, it was the most powerful one. What we didn't do in that study, that we did in the other study that I'll tell you about, is look at the possibility of there actually being reciprocal relationships. So when we had another year's worth of data, what that enabled us to do is look at, does school belonging influence later well-being, but also does well-being influence school belonging? And what we found there was that it is a reciprocal relationship. So how connected young people feel to school influences their well-being, but their well-being influences how connected they feel to school. So it's really kind of woven up in that kind of, these things that influence one another over time. And then the second part is the intervention stuff, which is obviously the focus of the PBE report. And we've been able to use the data that Power2 Rediscover, that Power2 were able to share on the young people that are taking part in the Power2 Rediscover program. And then we can use our BeWell data set, which is incredibly rich. And as I said, we've got tens and tens of thousands of young people that have taken part in the survey. And we're able to match, use a technique called propensity score matching to try and find young people in our data set who are very similar to the young people who are in the Power2 Rediscover dataset that have taken part in that program, so that we can then undertake a kind of really rigorous comparison of their well-being scores. And from that comparison then, as people that have read the report will have seen, we can have a look at the impact on well-being, and then as colleagues at Pro Bono Economics can explain much better than I can, the economic value, the social return on investment.
Thank you so much, Neil. I mean, it's really encouraging to hear that we can use the data to actually start proving causality, because that then gives the people doing the interventions the confidence to scale up and to explain to other people, and also perhaps educate people on what works and then also what doesn't work, because knowing what doesn't work means you don't need to waste resources on something that wasn't actually going to help those young people. I love the way you describe the kind of virtuous cycle you can get into if you help children get better, feel better connected to the school, and then improve their well-being, and then they feel even more connected. And it's the flip side of the vicious cycle that Julie mentioned earlier. And so I guess the whole idea of these interventions is to move people from a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle. But I know as an analyst that that's super difficult to measure. And so I wanted to move to Maliha to tell us a bit more about this tangled web that we describe in the report. What do we mean by the web, and how does it come out from the evidence?
Thank you, Tara, for the question. And thank you, Julie and Neil, for the discussion around the context. What I would like to do now is to take a step back and bring our attention to the broader challenge here, which is that the well-being of children and young people in the UK is alarmingly low, and it continues to decline over time. When young people are unhappy or struggling with their mental health, this often starts to manifest in other areas of their lives, including their engagement with school. This is clearly a very important interaction that shapes these children and young people's even future outcomes, like Neil mentioned and Julie mentioned, for example, employment or their greater quality of life. For some, this can lead to difficulties with attendance, and in severe cases, even emotionally based school avoidance, where anxiety and distress make attending school feel even more overwhelming. These challenges are becoming increasingly evident in the growing differences that we see in well-being outcomes when we compare it to similar groups of young people, like Neil mentioned within the Be Well dataset. And I think because we're talking about data, I'd like to bring in a bit of statistics here as well, which we did in the report with the OECD data, is that about 25% of young people in the UK report well-being. And among those who skip classes, this figure rises to 34%. And for those who don't feel a sense of belonging at school, this figure even jumps to higher at 42%. Although the existing evidence doesn't show a clear cause and effect link, but low well-being, school belonging, and attendance is likely to influence each other. And so understanding these interactions is crucial because it suggests that addressing any one of these factors in isolation, whether attendance, well-being, or belonging, may not be enough. Instead, we need to look at this in a more holistic approach and ensure that interventions support young people across multiple dimensions and not just one source.
Thank you, Maliha. And that's a brilliant bridge for us to turn to Julian, for him to give us a bit of a more detail around how is this tangled web idea and the growing concern around emotionally based school avoidance linked to what you do in the Power2 Rediscover program, and how are you trying to untangle this really complicated situation?
Okay, yeah, thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak on this, obviously a very serious subject. So I think working in schools, I think it's clear that, you know, schools and educators are concerned around the emotionally based school avoidance. You know, they want to see children in school. You only also have to look at the media. There's so many articles and coverage around children who are not attending school. I believe there was a report in 2022-23 academic year that said 1 in 5 pupils in England were persistently absent from school. So I haven't got a football stadium analogy, but in terms of a class of 30, we're talking like that's like 6 in a class. That's a large number, as you know, to be not in school and not being educated, and like the others have talked about what that then leads to. And I think what is focused a lot is on the end product, as in these children are not in school. But maybe what is less focused on is what can be done prior to that to stop it getting to this crisis point. Because, you know, once a child is outside of school, it is harder then to get them back in. It's obviously easier once they're in school. And I feel like in terms of emotionally based school avoidance, it might be good to see it as like a spectrum or a journey, because it's very rare that children start off as a school avoider. Most children do go, you know, we all see pictures, don't we, on the first day of school, and the children are smiling and parents are overjoyed. And then at some point, we are then talking about how serious this is with children persistently not in school. So I think one thing we can do is look at maybe how there is opportunities for interventions before we do get to that crisis point. So there are signs, I think, within schools, within what we might see as people who work in schools, but generally, because, as I say, a child might go to school every day, but it might be that you notice that it takes a lot out of them to be at school for every day. It might be that they, you know, then start attending school, but maybe they're not going to all their lessons. It might be that they're in lessons, but they're not that engaged. So there is a few steps along the way where you might sort of say, maybe this child needs a bit of support. You might get it where they then reduce their amount of time they are coming to school, or they then end up having a few days off, and that period of days increases. So as we go along, there are a few indicators that may sort of say this child could do with a little bit of additional support. Moving on to what we do with Power2 and Power2 Rediscover, we try and meet the young people where they are on that spectrum, on that continuum, and we try and get to know them as who they are, in order to try and understand what is the causes that they're facing, the challenges they're facing, their anxieties around school. So if you get to know the person, they're more likely to sort of explain what it is. It's not, you know, you have to learn who they are and what motivates them and what is going on behind that before you can sort of help them. So the program that we do, Power2 Rediscover, it was put together by some young people, or in collaboration with young people who'd already gone through on different Power2 programs. So it helps, I think, having that child focus, because they've got their own view, but also having like an adult themselves who's a trusted adult who has no relationship prior to meeting this young person. I think that also helps, because we're coming from it from fresh eyes, and I think the young people appreciate that. There's no preconceived ideas. We're not sort of saying, I think there is potential maybe to say, oh, couldn't a school teacher do these one-to-ones? But I think sometimes what happens is they might have had an altercation, a disagreement with a member of staff, and sometimes young people do sort of hold on to that and think, I can't work with this person, or if they work for the school, they might think that this person is on the side of school. So I think what we're able to do is, because we get to know the young person and we work with the school, we're able to be like that bridge between the young person and the school. And I think once we feed in some stuff back to the school that might help the young person, I think once the young person sees that the school are trying to put things in place, I believe that starts the process of them feeling like they belong. Because if someone does something that sort of understands them, then I think you think, oh, they do get me. So I think that's where we can help in that way, just by giving them that fresh start and looking at the positives of what they're doing. Sometimes what we can do is, I think school can sometimes focus, not intentionally, but the negative. So I would never say to someone, how come you're late? I would always say, oh, it's great to see you, because it reinforces that it's a positive. And I think with what we try and do is, with a program leads, is to create a psychologically safe place for these young people. And once it's a safe place, this is when they're able to open up and talk about their feelings a bit more, and talk about their fears and sometimes aspirations, because they just feel like this is someone who they can trust. And I believe, that when we talk about school belonging and school community, I think it's a big thing. All schools talk about it, but it's one of those things that can't be imposed from the top. I think it's something that the young person has to believe. They have to feel it for it to have any meaning. So I think that's what we try and do. We try and show them that they are valued, feed that back into the school, so that the school can sort of say, hey, you're doing well. They feel like they're belonging. And so it's like a full circle. We're all working together for the aim of boosting their morale, the well-being, and so that they can remain in school and get their education.
Thank you, Julian. That sounds such an incredibly powerful approach, with kind of no judgment, and meeting the child where they are and then building up from that seems to me like almost the only way you're going to get behavioral change and change those mindsets. And then the school can respond to that in an easier way when they've had that kind of opening in. And you talk beautifully about how those children then start to open up and start to feel trusting, that they're in a trusting environment, and start to see the positives themselves. So that's really inspiring. I guess I want to go to Maliha now and say, well, what do the numbers tell us? Because one-on-one, it's a wonderful concept, but it's also quite expensive, presumably. It takes a lot of resource, it takes a lot of effort. And so we need to make sure that it is delivering the kind of results that then make it worthwhile. So Maliha, can you give us a bit more insight into the takeaways from the report on the one-to-one support and the value for money?
Absolutely, Tara. I'm very excited to share the mainline findings of this report. So in our report, we've attempted to document the impact of the Power2 Rediscover program in the following ways. So firstly, with the help of the analysis done by Manchester's Be Well team, we find that participants in the Power2 Rediscover program could be improving well-being by an equivalent of 1.2 life satisfaction point. And this is compared to a group of young people who did not take part in the Power2 Rediscover program. So this was the control group. Secondly, what we have done is apply the HM Treasury framework guidance for valuing well-being to put a monetary value to the well-being outcomes delivered by the Power2 Rediscover program. Our main findings, at present, we are unsure of how long the effects of the Power2 Rediscover program last, and so we've made a range of assumptions in our analysis to reflect this uncertainty. While long-term impacts are uncertain, even short-term improvements can be meaningful. So our analysis suggests that as long as the well-being impact lasts for 5 weeks, the program is likely to deliver value for money. As I mentioned, there are several assumptions that we make in our report, and I would encourage everyone to have a look at that. But I would also like to mention 2 of these assumptions and what that says about our results. So firstly, if the well-being benefit lasts just 10 weeks, then the program generates £2 in well-being benefits for every £1 spent. If the well-being benefit lasts just 6 months, the program generates £5 in well-being benefits for every £1 spent. So in summary, the increase initially that we find in the life satisfaction point is quite large. It's actually about 2 times more than what UK adults experience when they go from being unemployed to employed. But it's also important to recognize as data analysts that the observed improvement in satisfaction among Power2 Rediscover programs cannot be solely attributed to the program, because the matching techniques that were used were restricted in some ways, hence leading us to a smaller sample size that we had to work with and analyze with. And I think this is a good time for Neil to help us expand on that.
Thank you, Maliha. Before we move on to Neil, and I think it's absolutely right that we also look at the limitations of how you can do this sort of analysis and are somewhat cautious about what conclusions we draw. But what you've described is absolutely incredible. Like our audience may not know what 1.2% on the well-being scale means, but it's huge, is all I'm going to say. And also the way you describe the value for money is you don't have to believe very much about the benefits of the program to already know that you're delivering massive benefits to these children. And of course, we are not even measuring the benefits to their siblings, their friends, their family, the whole society down the line, if those children's kind of life chances are improved as a result, which they almost certainly are. So this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, really, is how I describe it. But yes, we do need to obviously also understand how the analysis is done to be able to interpret it and be comfortable that we're using a robust analysis here. So Neil, what can you say to a non-technical audience here about some of the limitations and how we need to be a bit cautious about these estimates?
Yeah, thanks, Tara. What I'll do very quickly to start, if that's okay, is just say a little bit more about the strengths of the analysis, and then that will lead into some of the limitations. So the technique that I mentioned that was used in the analysis that underpinned the PBE analysis, we use, as I said, this technique called propensity score matching. That is a very, very robust technique in this kind of context where it's not feasible or possible to do a randomized trial. It's essentially like the next best thing. It helps to eliminate potential bias, so we can be confident in that. The second thing that I'd say in terms of strengths is, in the same way that Maliha and team have looked at kind of different kind of costing assumptions and different time horizons and so on. When we did our analysis, there's lots of different ways that you can do propensity score matching. There's about 7 or 8 of different kind of PSM techniques. We don't just choose one and go with that. We have our preferred matching technique, but we also do what we call sensitivity analysis. So we say, if we match in this different way, do we get the same results? What about if we match in this way? And effectively, then we can look across and say, how consistently do we find this effect? And we did find it consistently. And our analyst Chi-Chi did a whole range of additional things called permutation tests, basically ways of trying to rule out, or being more certain in the results. On the limitations, though, the kind of key thing I would say is the thing for the audience to be mindful of is the data that we have from the Power2 Rediscover participants that we then matched our BeWell participants is their well-being at a particular point in time. And as a result of that, what we've not been able to model in this analysis is change over time. So that's the main limitation, really, in terms of the kind of inferences that we can make is we can say, these very well matched group of young people compared to Power2 Rediscover participants experience higher levels of well-being at this particular point in their lives compared to those that haven't participated in the program. What we've not done is look at change over time, and that's the kind of key limitation. Ideally, what you want to be able to do is say, before they had Power2 Rediscover, what was their well-being, and then we do the same with our group, and then after and look at kind of what we call difference in differences. But with what we've got here, this is still very, very promising findings. It's just, you know, ideally we'd want multiple time points, and then we can start to look at that kind of much longer term follow-up. But what this gives us really powerfully is evidence of promise that we can then build on to kind of keep building the evidence base for programs like Power2 Rediscover.
Thank you, Neil. And I wanted to go back to Julian another time to kind of almost like contrast. Now, we've heard about the technical analysis that is really strong and powerful in explaining how this program and this approach in particular has this powerful benefit for those young people. But I wanted to ask you, Julian, whether that reflects your feelings and your experiences on the ground. What do you see this when you work with these young people, that they kind of visibly improve in their well-being and their school attendance and in their sort of sense of belonging?
Yeah, I do. I do. I think, especially obviously working so closely one-to-one with anyone, but the young people, and they're open and honest, and you can see just through their own way they are, with how they're speaking to you, but also how they speak with other members of staff around the school or interact with the young people, or just when they sort of think of opportunities they can see. I think of, I've worked with a lot of young people, but one sort of thing that sort of struck me working with a young girl recently, who she was on a safety plan because her well-being was low when I first met her, and you know, it took a few weeks of, you know, doing the one-to-one sessions to build up a bit of rapport. And she said something to me that I feel like is stuck with me, in that she spoke about the fact that she would struggle to come into school. Often when I'd see her, when we'd have our check-in, she would often say to me, I don't want to be in school, or, you know, pleaded with my parents not to let me come into school today. And so we had to overcome that challenge and that barrier. And you know, I looked at things, but just getting to know her and understand her. And she said to me one time, she'd been in all week, and the teacher had said to her, you know, you've had a good week. And she said to me, but the thing is, the teacher said I had a good week, but for me to come in every day and go to my lessons, it didn't feel like a good week for her, because it took so much out of her. And she sort of said, and this isn't having to go at school staff or anything, but sometimes when you look at, like, she's attended, she's got a tick on the register, you've had a good week. But having the one-to-ones, we were able to discuss what a good week felt for her. And I think having that, acknowledging that, sometimes I think it's their reality. So a teacher can say to you, you've had a good week. But if what they perceive as a good week took it out of you, then that doesn't marry with what they're saying, which is similar to, sort of say, with the idea of belonging in a school. That has to be real for them, you know. And so once they can lift their morale, because over time with this student, I worked a lot on, like, her strengths, focused on where she had overcome challenges, worked on her resilience. So over time, I think she believed that she could do these things. She could see that these were actually happening, and so believed in them. And again, I feel like by doing that, she was able to feel like, well, maybe she does belong in school, and her attendance did improve, and she did come off the safety plan. And I think I see it with a lot of the young people. It might be sometimes more subtle changes, but just how they are around the school, it does feel like they are part of a community. They are part of that school, and they're able to get maybe encouraged to go and do different activities. So I do honestly see the changes within them. And sometimes the changes are subtle, but I think sometimes the issues they face can be subtle, that we don't always recognize because they don't present in a certain way. The young girl I was talking about, she was often not in lessons, but she presented as calm. So sometimes the school wouldn't always associate, but I knew she struggled to go into certain lessons that were noisy, the environment wasn't quite right. You know, there might have been under 9 SEND. So by getting to know that person, I'm able to feed that back, but I'm also able to help put things in place and support. So I honestly, you know, do believe that what we do as program leads with Power to Rediscover is noticeable, and it does have an impact for the young people. So I do think that, because I do believe that children should be in school, learning, enjoying, and they, that has to be the main priority from my point of view, lifting their morale, lifting their well-being, and making them feel like they belong.
Thank you, Julian. It sounds incredibly rewarding to be seeing those changes on the ground. And I'm going to go back to Julie. In some ways, you must already know that this works, in your heart of hearts, and from your people on the ground and from the children you work with on a day-to-day basis, you will have seen those changes. So how do you think this kind of slightly more technical and sort of evidence-based report that pro bono economics has helped with now adds to that evidence base and helps you maybe take those kinds of programs even further forward?
Thanks, Sarah. So there's plenty of evidence, as you say, about the benefits of one-to-one support, particularly from a trusted adult like Julian, not otherwise known to the child. And at Power2, we know that our own programmes work from our own evaluations and from the feedback we get from schools, parents and young people. But it's really great to also have the findings of the economic value of one-to-one support. It's important because it helps to demonstrate to policymakers why it's vital to provide this kind of support to children and young people at risk of slipping through the cracks, and to bridge the gap between the child and the school. And this support doesn't just impact on the individual child or young person, but also helps achieve an effective, well-functioning and successful society. It's only fair that every child and young person should have every chance to contribute. And this analysis shows that investing in their well-being is a sensible investment that really pays back.
Thank you, Julie. That's a really positive message, isn't it, coming through, building on what you already knew, but even amplifying it beyond that, and being able to hopefully convince sometimes skeptical policymakers and other people out there that this is indeed very much worth it. I want to finish off this conversation amongst ourselves by asking each of you in turn to tell us a bit about what you think the key takeaways are for our schools and policymakers from this work, and what kind of change you'd like to see. We want to move on to audience questions about quarter two, so keep it relatively brief if you can. And I'm just going to suggest I go in the order that you appear on my screen, because that's the easiest and most democratic way to do it. So, Neil, would you like to start, please?
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, I'll speak to the policymaker side of things. I think what this work shows us, in addition to the value of interventions like Power2 Rediscover, is how important it is to have really good data on these aspects of young people's lives. So we've got national data on attainment, attendance, exclusions, etc. We need national data on young people's well-being and the things that drive their well-being. So one of the key things that we've been doing is campaigning for, with Pro Bono Economics and the Children's Society and other partners, the government to actually take the kind of the model that we have in Be Well and have something national like that. And what that would unlock, in addition to all kinds of other benefits, is more of these kinds of really rigorous analyses and independent analyses of programs like Power2 Rediscover. So from my point of view, policymakers, it's about national wellbeing measurement and using the power of that data to get a better evidence base for things that we can do to improve young people's lives.
Thanks, Neil. And so often we hear that call for more data, but here's an actual real use case for where we have used data and we can demonstrate that having more of it would actually genuinely answer some incredibly important questions and really inform national policy as well. So it's a wonderful case study, I think, in that context. Meliha, what would you like our audience to take away, and what would you like to see happen differently in the future?
Thanks, Tara. I think I echo with Neil here as economist and as someone representing PBE, where we work with understanding data and understanding the economic impact of interventions. I think what we're trying to say is that we need further strengthening of the evidence base. And of course, to do that, like Neil said, we need to improve the quality of data, which makes us understand that greater investment in data collection will enable us a better understanding of the well-being impacts on children and the value of interventions like one-to-one support provided by charities such as Power2. And I think this is a good time to talk about this campaign, Neil, that you are, of course, part of, is that the Our Wellbeing, our coalition consisting of Be Well, Pro Bono Economics, and Children's Society, and also the Fair Education Alliance, which is where we're advocating for a cross-sector working group to guide the rollout of a national well-being measurement program. And this is important because, improving the well-being to ensure that children's needs and demands are accurately understood and acted upon.
Thank you, Meliha. Julia, what would be your sort of main takeaways? You've already shared such a lot of vision for where this could take us societally, but if you pick one or two things, what would you like to see change?
So I would like all children and young people to be given the support they need to thrive and succeed at school, because that's only fair and just. But also that investment is needed, and it's needed now. So at Power2, we've been delivering the government's Safe Task Force programme to young people in Manchester and Southwark. And that task force supports children and young people through one-to-one support up and down the country. But the funding for that ends at the end of this month, which will leave thousands of young people without the support they need to fully engage with their education and their futures. Young people in similar positions to the girl that Julian mentioned earlier. And we must not let these young people go without support and slip through the cracks.
Thank you. That's such an important message, I think, to keep in mind and amplify as well. So finally, Julian, what would you like to see happening? What change would you like to see?
Similar to what's been mentioned, I think we just have to invest in these young people. I think they have the right to feel like they belong at school. We're at school for a long time, whether that's one day, the whole week, up to year, 11. And I think not only are we investing in them now as children, but obviously they're going to grow up into adulthood, and their well-being, if we can help them, support them as children, will only, hopefully maintain as they're going to adult life, and that benefits them, the family, society, etc. So I think, just invest in young people, because they are the future.
Wonderful. That is a brilliant call for all of us to continue to amplify. Now, we do have a lot of really excellent audience questions. And the first one is quite an obvious one, but not something we've managed to spend a lot of time today yet on, which is, what's the role of parents in this mix of young people and their belonging to the school? And maybe I can go, Julian, to you first with your kind of first-hand experience of how those dynamics might play out.
From what I've seen, parents are supportive of the school and of the young people, and they want their children to be in school. They want them to be getting educated. One thing I've noticed is that a lot of the parents I speak to, they have their own well-being, mental health concerns. So sometimes it's not that they're not trying, but sometimes the challenges they face, they're struggling themselves to then deal with the issues with their child. So I do feel like, obviously, parents in an ideal situation, we have parents that are on board and doing that, and I do feel like they do, but it is difficult at times. So I think where schools can support, and where people like myself and other program leads can help, I think we do, and try and bring school, the child, parent together.
Thank you. Do any of the other panelists have any thoughts on the role of parents, either from the kind of evidence perspective or just broader systematic sort of change? If not, Julia, yes, please, Julia.
So I think the parent-child relationship is really, really important in terms of sense of belonging. And so parental support and encouragement towards young people's schooling enhances their sense of connectedness to the school, but equally parents being involved in the school community. But as I said at the beginning, it's really important that we don't punish parents for their children not being in school, and also acknowledge that they themselves may not have felt a sense of belonging when they were at school. my daughter had educationally based school avoidance, and it's really, really hard, absolutely heartbreaking to deal with. And for us, the real difference was that the Senko at the school was incredibly supportive and worked closely with me and with her in order to get her back to school. So it's a partnership, I think, with everybody.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. And I guess building on that kind of question of, there's the child and then there's the people around them, and that all has an impact on their lives. One of our questions here is about, you talked about community, and the question is about, what about these huge kind of mega schools? Does the size of the school have an impact on young people's sense of belonging, and how does that then play out in terms of potentially school avoidance or potentially their well-being impacts? Anyone particularly want to come in on that? Otherwise, I'm going to go. Yeah, Maliha, please.
Sure, I can go on this. So I think what the question is saying, what role is of charities or social sector in education, and why don't schools just deliver this program, right? So, even if we were designing a system just from scratch with infinite budget, it's still a good case for both. I mean, the social sector working in partnership with charities, and they can offer a different way of engaging young people that can feel more independent of these services. And I think one of the things to look at is that these large schools, they can work in partnership with charities to understand where the need is more important. And I think the other way we can see is to understand evidence of what works. So once we know what is working, we can employ them in more schools, and then naturally and gradually involve other people to, roll this out in a more massive scale.
Thanks, Maliha. Very interesting. And another audience question is going back to that idea of, how what you do one-on-one with the children then links to the broader system. There's a practical question here about, do you have the ability to refer these young people to other services if that becomes apparent as a need when you work with them, or indeed kind of with their parents and with the school and the teachers?
There is that opportunity to do that. We do signpost young people to other organisations, but in terms of within the school, I think I know I will speak with people to see if they can be referred within school organisations that come into school, and if required, Power2 could. I could feed that information back to Power2 and see what we can do for the young person. So we are trying to support, as anything that we can do to support the young person. We do try and do that. So yeah, there is scope to do that.
Thank you very much. Great. There are a couple more analytical questions here as well, and somebody's very interested, in fact, knowing more about the linkages that we could make with this data with the National Pupil Database. And are there any ways to either link the data or use even just the National Pupil Database itself to get a better sense of this idea of belonging, or at least a proxy for it? Neil, perhaps you have some thoughts on that?
I'll give that one a go. So the linkage question I'll answer first. Again, one of the advantages of BeWell is we were set up for data linkage from the get-go. So we already link our data that we gather in the surveys to data that's shared by local authorities and schools. But the information that we have enables us to link to data that's in the National Pupil Database. So perfect example at the moment is we're in the process of analysing trajectories of attendance in school over the course of time. And then because we've got the data linked to our survey data, we can then start to look at things like some of the things we've been talking about today, whether a driver of kind of decline in school attendance might be related to mental health needs, lack of school belonging, etc., etc. So we're set up for data linkage from the get-go. In relation to what's already in the National Pupil Database that might be a useful proxy, I mean, the challenge that we have in the NPD is effectively you've got data on suspensions, permanent exclusions, attendance, and of course attainment. Now, any of those might be a kind of a fairly distant proxy right? They're all, but you know, for any of those, there's lots of reasons, for example, why a young person might get excluded. There's lots of reasons why a young person might not do well academically. There's lots of reasons why they might not attend school frequently, of which school belonging is one part of the puzzle. So I think currently there isn't anything that I would say is a really good indicator available in the National Pupil Database. But again, that speaks to the kind of point that we made earlier about actually having a national system for monitoring of wellbeing and the drivers of wellbeing, and then we wouldn't need proxies. We would have the actual data to use.
Really, really interesting. And linked to that question around data and data gathering, this is, of course, incredibly sensitive data as well. And there's a question from the audience, both, I guess, at the kind of broader level of Be Well, but also specifically for Power2 Rediscover. So how do you manage that tension of maybe people feeling uncomfortable sharing their data, even with trusted researchers? So maybe Neil, you can come on that, and then either Julie or Julian could give us an idea of how you talk to the participants about that data gathering process.
Yeah. So we have, because we're a research institute, we have very, very stringent guidelines that we have to follow on issues to do with, you know, this kind of thing. So all of the young people that take part in Be Well and that provide data for Be Well, we go through, there's a governance process in terms of making sure that parents are aware that we're going to be gathering the data and have the opportunity to opt their children out if they don't agree with them doing it. But the really important element then is that when we do the survey with young people, first of all, the fact that it's been developed in consultation with young people means that for the most part, actually, then young people are really happy to complete it because it reflects issues that are important to them. So we've asked young people before we created the survey what's important to them, and then the survey reflects that. So they're much more likely to engage with it. But every young person has the choice, and some young people, you know, if they're not feeling like they want to do a survey, they always have the option not to complete it. Even if they complete it, they have the option for any given item or measure, they can always skip it. So there's always choice and agency for the young person. And we give schools really clear instructions if there are young people that don't want to take part or that have been opted out by their parents or carers, that schools, you know, have alternative activities for those young people to take part in. And the final thing I'd say before handing over to Julie is we have really clear kind of young person friendly instruction sheets. So basically, so that they're fully aware of what the research is about, how the data will be used, you know, all that kind of stuff is all made really, really clear. And again, that links back to our ethics process. So we have to go through a really stringent ethical approval process to get to the point where we're given approval by the university to undertake projects like this.
Yeah, and for us, similarly to Neil, we work on the basis of consent. We always get the consent of the young people and of the parents if the young people are under 16. We give them choice and agency. They don't have to complete the evaluations. But also we choose our evaluation metrics really, really carefully. So we use the outcome star, which is very much child-centred and is a way of them plotting what they want to achieve through the programme, as well as measuring their progress. But also the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, which is on the one hand a really great validated scale with a huge database behind it. On the other hand, uses very friendly and simple language. So we make sure that young people feel really comfortable in completing those. Our programme leads like Julian will introduce them at the point at which the young people are feeling more comfortable and trust in the process, and support them to complete it in the sense of we will make sure that if they feel in the slightest bit distressed, we will either intervene, stop them from doing it, or support them afterwards, or explain what some of the words mean if they don't quite understand, without influencing their answers. So it's a much, I think we've both made it sound quite rote, but it's not, is it? I think in both cases we think very, very carefully and work really hard on making sure that the young people are not further distressed by answering the questions that we are using to evaluate. And that's a really, really important point for us.
Terrific, and it's really reassuring, but not surprising to hear that. I mean, it's only sustainable to do these things when you do them really well and thoughtfully, as is clear that all of you are doing. I feel like we've had such an incredible conversation, all the way from kind of really practical things on the ground that, you know, Julian and his colleagues work with, and literally that kind of human connection that makes all the difference to these young people, to then the sort of more data-related issues, which analytically are really important, so we can make the case robustly to policymakers and other stakeholders that the value for money is there. And as you said many times, we need to invest in young people. They are our future. And then all the way to the broader systemic issues of how these links to, you know, how the teachers and the schools and the parents and the system treat these children. And, you know, there's just so many takeaways. I'm not even going to try and summarize any of them. I think for me, this is just a kind of fantastic case study of a collaboration that has been very, very fruitful and hopefully has benefits well beyond that kind of narrow area. I don't want to call it narrow, but like a very specific area of evaluating this particular program. There are a lot of lessons learned for other programs as well. But just, you know, taking a huge step back from all of that, just the main message here around this: it's not acceptable for us to be living in a society where these children feel like they're not being included. And there are solutions to that problem. So we therefore need to go out and put those solutions in place at scale. And all of the things we've discussed today will help us do that in a more systemic manner. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our brilliant panelists and speakers today. Thank you to our audience for joining us and your really insightful and thoughtful questions. If you'd like to continue to join PBE webinars, make sure that you sign up to our newsletter, and you can see more about what we do on our website as well. And the link should be appearing in the chat in a minute. And the last thing that remains to be said is thank you to everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.